They want to know, who the hell is this guy and can I trust you? And do you even know what you're talking about? Are you even an authority, right? So how do you get that information across? Because that's the first thing the buyer wants to know, but they're not going to ask you, Mario, are you an authority? Do you have a clue what you're talking about? You're going to have to seed that into the conversation, and you do that with stories.
I want to welcome you to my sales podcast, where we have one focus and one focus only. That is helping you, the sales community, and sales leaders create more conversations with more qualified buyers, ultimately leading to improving your sales productivity and closing more deals. Each show, you will hear from sales leaders, practitioners, and influencers to help you find, engage, and connect with more buyers. I'm Mario Martinez Jr., and you're now listening to the Selling with Social Sales Podcast. Oh man, we're in for a treat today, guys. Welcome to Selling with Social, and on today's podcast, we've got my friend, the storyteller, the chief storyteller, Mr. Mike Adams, author of 7 stories every salesperson must tell. And let me tell you guys, you are in for an amazing treat, because we've got some content here that is going to help you not only create more conversations, but win more deals and build stronger relationships through the use of storytelling. Mr. Mike Adams, welcome to the show, my friend.
Well, thank you, Mario. Talking to your listeners from just turning daylight in Melbourne in the future.
In the future, that's what I love about this conversation, is that you actually know what happened here in the United States before I do.
That's it. We're ahead of you here.
Exactly. Well, listen, man, I'm so excited that you're on with us. The storyteller leader, that's what we call you. And you've made a great name for yourself, really learning how to teach salespeople the art of storytelling and how to leverage that. So I'm excited to have you on board. You've been a great friend, and I can't wait to have this conversation. But do me a favor, just tell us a little bit about you, and then I have a personal question specifically for you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm an engineer that should not have been a salesperson, Mario. I ended up being a salesperson and selling in 9 countries and more than $1 billion worth of stuff. I started as an engineer in London. I was called into the boss's office. He said, Mike, great career opportunity for you. We want you to move to Norway and be a salesperson. And I'm, Norway good, salesperson bad. Don't want to do that. I actually said, my wife's 8 months pregnant. I can't go. And when I went home that night, she said, no, she wanted to go to Norway. So we had our second child in Norway. He happens to be blonde hair, by the way, but that's just a coincidence. Yeah, so I became a salesperson. And Mario, I would have gone back to engineering, because engineers we struggle to be good salespeople, because we like to solve problems before we have the permission to sell them. That's the problem with us technical people. I had a lot of good fortune. I was really lucky in my first rookie year. I sold the biggest deal just really by good fortune. And so I stayed in sales, and I moved from country to country. I was running sales teams, pretty big sales teams. And then I had this experience. I came back to Australia. I needed a job, but I was working in oil and gas software for 17 years overseas, and there was no oil and gas. So I needed to move industry. And I know I told a very good story to get a job, because I had no qualifications whatsoever for my new industry. But I had this experience, and I had it repeated 5 or 6 times. And some of your listeners might have had this as well, which is you're coming into a situation where you really know nothing. You don't even know what you don't know. You can't speak the language of your new industry. You don't know your client. You don't know your products and services. You don't know your own company, but you have to sell something. You've got about 8 months, or, you don't stay. And that's where I learned that you needed certain stories. You had to be able to find some stories to be able to tell the client and to be able to understand how things were going on. And most corporations, I was working for a really big German corporation then, that was with Siemens, they don't have those stories prepared for salespeople. They've got 100-slide PowerPoint packs. They don't have the stories, right?
Yeah. The what to, the when to, the product slicks. Yeah. It's funny because when I move from organization to organization, whenever I move, I always ask for the OPS. Do you know what the OPS is?
No. What's the OPS?
I want all of the other people's stories, the OPS.
Correct.
Give
That's
me
it.
the OPS because I can sell OPS because I don't have my own, right?
That's right. So this is a critical insight. So I did that. I changed industry 5 or 6 times. And then in 2014, I set out consulting with a couple of partners to work with sales teams to help sales teams. And as you probably know, salespeople are, they're impossible to teach anything because, your average salesperson knows everything they need to know, right? Because they've sold stuff and they must be good. It's extremely challenging to do anything. But what they do enjoy, salespeople really enjoy storytelling, and they enjoy learning about. So I usually tell them something like, I know you're telling stories because you couldn't have sold a thing if you weren't telling stories, but here's a structure and here's a way to think about what story to tell when through the buying process. And they like that. They resonate with that and they remember it because it's stories. Yeah. So that's like one of the few things that you can get to grips with a sales team pretty quickly and really help them in a short period of time is with stories. And that was a pretty interesting insight. And
well,
then
speaking of
write the book.
I was going to say, and then you wrote the book. Speaking of stories, I'm looking for a juicy story from you, man. As you know, as a listener of the Selling with Social podcast, I always ask my guests a question, and that is, tell us something nobody would know about you, even if they were looking at your social profiles. So give me something juicy. We've had everything from something boring like I've got a couple kids to, you may remember our show, they had an extra appendage. So what's something nobody would know about you, Mike?
Well, I'm sitting here with a swollen ankle this morning, and almost exactly 1 year ago, I decided to dust off my old windsurfer. I used to do wave windsurfing when I was young, and I've always kept the board, right? And I've always thought, I'll go back and do that again, right? And this is like the last time I took it out was probably 20 years before that. And so I did that. I went down to the beach, went out about 300 meters, fell in, came back and lay on the beach for about 30 minutes, gasping like a beach whale. And I thought, I'm just so unfit. This is ridiculous. And I'm going to die if I don't do something. And so I realized that I couldn't windsurf. We didn't live that close to the coast. So I decided to go back to doing something else I did as a young person, which was rock climbing. And I started climbing in a free rock climbing gym. I have 3 boys. They're all in their 20s. All 3 of them decided rock climbing was a really cool thing to do too. So they joined me. And for the last year, I have been rock climbing pretty much fanatically 2 or 3 times a week. I'm super fit and slim, and I've got a sore ankle because I fell off a rock this weekend.
Well, I wish I could be like you because I am not super fit and I am not super slim. and
rock climbing,
you don't have a choice. You'll love this story. Just the other day, my 5-year-old, I live in Northern California in the East Bay, and in the East Bay, it's very hot right now. In fact, it's 100 degrees outside. And this is a funny story. You'll love this one. I took off my shirt. It was at dinner time. My wife likes the house at 85 degrees. It drives me bananas. My oldest and I, we like our house at like 77 degrees. Like we're comfortable. 78 is probably, good temperature. So she's like, well, take off your shirt. Don't turn up the air conditioning. So I take off my shirt and my 5-year-old looks at me and he goes, oh, Daddy. And I was like, what? And he goes, your chi-chis are fat. Now I can say that because this is my show. So he grabs my breast, and he starts pinching, and I'm like, get off my chest, get off my chest. Anyway, so it basically told me that I've been sitting in my chair in this office far too long for far too many hours. So that's my story and my 5-year-old, but out of the mouth of babes, they speak truth, right?
That's it. So so that's my fitness turnaround. I was also needed to lose a fair bit of weight. So there you go.
Fair enough. Well, now listen, let's get into some meat, because when we think about this particular book here, 7 stories every salesperson must tell. And for those of you listening in, we'll put it into the show notes, the Amazon link. I encourage you to pick it up. I'm actually holding it right here, right now, and have gone through the book here. When you think about storytelling, there are a number of books out there that speak about storytelling, but I want to first understand, first off, how do you think the use of storytelling can help the average salesperson? And I just mentioned to you the concept of OPS, right? Other people's stories. Correct. And that's the first thing that I would do when came in, is I want other people's stories so that when I'm talking to buyers and prospects and customers, I can leverage those stories. So what I'm curious about is How can storytelling really help a salesperson? Let's start out with that first.
Yeah. So most of those books that you're talking about, and I have most of them behind me on my bookshelf, they're mostly written from the perspective of a leader, like a CEO, and how do I lead and inspire people with stories, or a change management program and using stories for that. There's not too much written on sales storytelling. There is a little bit, but the difference with sales storytelling is we're not just telling stories and the job is done. Salespeople need to get into a story exchange. So we tell a story to get a story. And this is a fundamental feature of what really good salespeople do. A really good salesperson says something like, that reminds me of, or there's a client I was working with who, and they start telling the story and then they go, and how's things around here? And then you get back the client story. And because you've told a true story, warts and all, what things went wrong and all the rest of it, you get back the true situation. And most sales instruction is about questioning and listening. And there's all these fancy questions you should ask. And there's a bit of an issue with that, really, which is, the client's not really that inclined to answer all your fancy questions until they trust you, until it's all contextualized. So really, it's the stories and the questions together that have to go hand in hand that make for a really powerful sales conversation. And that's really missing in instruction. That how to do that has not really been written about at all, I would say, for sales conversations.
Are you suggesting, Mike, that using a story, as many times when we start doing like our first prospecting call, we'll have a call, we'll ask questions, what's going on with this, how's going with that? Are you suggesting that using short stories or long stories, or like depending on where you're at in the sales process, using a short story can actually help solicit a buyer to actually give you what's on their mind and or their experience and or answer questions without you potentially even have to ask questions?
Yeah, that's really insightful how you ask that question. So when you're prospecting, you're reaching out to someone who isn't expecting your contact typically.
Right.
So you can't tell a full story usually in that context if it's over the telephone. You might be able to put a full story into an email, a short one. But what I coach people to do is to tell half the story in the outreach. So half the story might be the setting and the problem of a client like them. And then you don't finish it. So you're basically using the curiosity of how does this story end to start the prospecting. And then when you meet face to face, you might say, well, I'd like to tell you about that situation. But before that, maybe I tell you a little bit about me, my personal story, and then I hand it over and say, well, Mario, what about you? How did you get into podcasting and running a digital transformation program? And then you tell me your story. And this is like using storytelling for rapport building. And then we swap business stories. So in a first meeting, we're exchanging typically personal, who am I and am I really an authority? Right. And then business stories. But in that prospecting, we might just do a little curiosity thing. We've just looked at the research results back from our R&D department. They've been looking into this thing, couldn't believe what they found. Could I come and have a chat with you about it?
Right.
I haven't told you the full story, right? But I've given you an interesting setting or a curious setup. That's how Netflix is a multi-tens of billion-dollar industry, right? They give you the first part of the series and then it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 to listen to the next thing or to watch the next program. So You're using the cliffhanger to get the story. Does that make sense to you, Mario?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. So when you think about, in particular, the 7 stories every salesperson must tell, clearly this is written specifically for salespeople, yeah?
Correct. That's right. The 7 stories are written for a buying cycle. So they start with, what are the stories that will help me connect with a potential buyer? Mm-hmm. What are the stories that will help me change their mind? Because selling is about changing people's mind. It's about changing the direction your client's going. And then what are the stories that will help me close the deal? So each of the 7 stories steps you through, this is the sort of story that will do that purpose. And each of the story types has a different central character. You talked about OPS, other people's stories. Salespeople have to be able to tell other people's stories. Most people are good at telling stories about what happened to themselves. It takes a bit of experience and practice to tell other people's stories, but you need to get through that buying cycle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and I'll give you, this is something that we may naturally just do anyways, but today I had hosted a call with an executive vice president of an extremely large Fortune 100 company. We were going over working on a particular project and looking at how we expand that in a significant way. And so without at all prompting, soliciting, or even planning, I started telling a story in the beginning, and it was a personal related story about, my kids and something that happened. I forget how we got on that, and everybody just had a great laugh at it. And then somebody else started telling a story about, their children. And we spent the first 10 minutes, really like storytelling and building that relationship component. Right. And so as you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking like, this is something that I just generally, me as a person, I do just to build rapport and relationships, because that's how we learn. We learn through stories. I mean, just think about from the beginning of time, how did we learn about history? How did we learn about, historical facts, anything, legends, cultures? It was all as a result of storytelling until eventually someone began writing about it and those types of things, right? So this is kind of ingrained in almost human history, but yet as sellers, we get so fixated on, as an SDR or as a salesperson, I got to have a 15-minute meeting. And that 15-minute, I'm going to ask, blah, 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 and then try to assess if there's an opportunity. And then once I assess it, now I'm going to move on. And I forget all about the actual relationship building part of a meeting. And that's one of the things I tell sellers. And I don't necessarily know if you have an opinion on this or not. But first off, I have a video and it's called the 15-minute meeting. It's stupid. Stop it. Right? It's a stupid request. It's a stupid ask. It's a stupid meeting that you'd have, because you cannot build relationship in 15. It takes me 10 minutes just to build relationship with somebody on a virtual call where I'm seeing them face to face. So how could you spend another 5 doing prospecting? So that's why it's kind of confusing to me why we ask for 15-minute meetings.
Yeah. So there was a lot in what you said there that I'd like to touch on. The first thing you said was that you tell something personal. And you might have noticed that when I introduced myself, I told you about my wife being 8 months pregnant and our second child was born. When you put that personal stuff into that little personal story at the beginning, and then you say something, well, what about you, Mr. Buyer? How did you get into your job? What you get back is a bit of their career and a bit of their personal stuff. And when you exchange personal details, I call that the start of friendship, really. That's when you start being friends. And this is a really misunderstood thing in selling. Like no one really has written about how do you actually create rapport. People talk about, some people are likable and others aren't, and there's this mystery thing. And some people talk about the photograph on the client's desk or whatever, but that's fake. But if you explain who you are and why you do what you do in a little story, and then say, what about you? And you exchange stories. This is rapport building, actually. This is what really good salespeople do. They do it unconsciously, naturally. And salespeople need to learn. This is one of the reasons why it's hard to learn how to sell, right? Because that's hard to teach that stuff. But what I do when I work with sales teams, we do a full day on storytelling for rapport. How do I tell my personal story because, think about the buyer. That buyer doesn't know who you are. You want to talk about business, and they want to know, who the hell is this guy, and can I trust you? And do you even know what you're talking about? Are you even an authority, right? So how do you get that information across? Because that's the first thing the buyer wants to know, but they're not going to ask you, Mario, are you an authority? Do you have a clue what you're talking about? You're going to have to seed that into the conversation, and you do that with stories. It's critically important. It's the most important thing. If you can't get past that rapport building part, you can't sell, because you don't get to the next step. They don't trust you.
It's funny. I was just thinking through again what I do. I want to get to the point here of this question, really, how hard is it to learn storytelling? But I'm going to tee it up with, a story. And the story is that oftentimes when I'm asked to join by our sales team a client meeting, a prospecting meeting, a potential buyer meeting, inevitably, one of the first things that people do is, hey, how's everybody doing? Or nice to meet you. How are you doing? Right? That's just the normal thing to do. And one of the things that I generally try to do is I try to do something that will loop them in. And I'll say, oh, no, it's great to meet you. And answer how I'm doing. Well, honestly, I've been going back to back on meetings, and I literally have not had even a chance to pee. Right? Like, I'll use that one. And maybe that's a little too bold for some people. So the other one is just a little frustrated. And they're like, frustrated? Why are you frustrated? You would not believe that how my day is packed right now. And I have literally, as you probably know this, I haven't even eaten breakfast yet. And by the way, that's a true story. It's 3:26 p.m. and I still have not eaten breakfast. And I've been on the calls since 7 o'clock. I've gotten up twice to go take my dog the puppy to go out and go pee, but I haven't even had a chance to do it myself, and I'm on conference calls. So as soon as I say that, it opens up the door for someone to say, I totally understand how you feel, right? Especially if it's an executive alignment.
You are including into your story absolutely normal human things that they can relate to and key off. And it's funny, they will very often tell you a little story about when they couldn't pee or something silly like that, but it's a connection, right? People are looking to connect before they do business. Now, you work in the United States. I've worked all over the world, including the US. And the US is a get down to business kind of country, but still people want to know that they can trust you first.
Yeah,
if you work in Asia and other parts of the world, getting to know you takes a few weeks and months, right? We're not talking business for quite some time, right? Absolutely. So it's really important to know that we've got to trust each other and know who we are before we're going to open up and tell you the true story about how things are around here, right? If I ask you a fancy question out of my sales textbook here about to what extent is this an issue, and you don't trust me, I'm not going to get a true story about how things are at your company. No way. I'm going to get some glue. Everything's fine. Everything's fine around here.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So do you think it's hard for a seller to learn how to be a storyteller? I mean, like I just gave examples and someone listening in right now on the phone might be like, oh, I kind of do the same thing. Like we may be unconsciously competent. And honestly, until this conversation, I never really thought about, why do I say, oh my God, super frustrated? And then I let them say, why? Because I haven't been able to, or I'm sorry, I haven't even peed, not one time. And so I'm going to get through this meeting and then I'm going to finally take a break. Why do I do that? And I never really thought about that. I know every single time I'm going to reel them in. It's like I throw the line out with the bait and it's going to reel them in. I've been unconsciously competent, I suppose. So do you think it's hard for salespeople to learn storytelling? Again, let me tee this up with, in private conversation, you and I were having a conversation one-on-one and, I can tell stories all day long, but maybe in a group format or with a couple people, especially virtually, it might be a little bit harder.
You and I know that the proportion of salespeople that are really fluent with storytelling is a small proportion. I'm sure your listeners are all brilliant at this, but there is something that you need to do that maybe isn't quite natural. It isn't that natural to talk about something personal about yourself in a business meeting. I liken it to doing a cold call. You need to get the courage to put yourself out there in the same way as a cold call. That's not that comfortable, right? But once you've done it a few times and you're seeing that it works, then it's okay. And what we do is I use video messaging to coach storytelling. So I get people to tell me their story in a minute or two, and then I'll coach them back on video messages. It's good from the point of view of time management for me as a coach, but it's really good for them because they listen to themselves before they send the video and they go, I don't like how that sounds, and they practice it. So it's worth doing a little practice how I would tell my personal story with a coach. And then when you actually do it in an important meeting, you've had some practice at it. So it's one of those things like anything, Mario, the more you do it, the better you get at it. Like
sales, period, right?
Absolutely.
The more you do it, the better you get at it. Yeah. You talk about something in the book here, and I'm going to derail you on this one, but it's really around that business stories. So we talked a lot about the personal stories. Now let's transition into some of the business stories. And that's that OPS I mentioned earlier, other people's, and I'm not referring to other people's personal stories. I'm referring to other people's business success stories with clients. And you mentioned something here about business stories that salespeople tell must be scrupulously true.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that. What does that mean?
What that means is that you will only tell stories that you have researched and have the details and know actually happened, and you tell them as they happened. You won't embellish those stories. You won't pretend that you were the person there and you weren't there. You won't make up stuff. And the reason for that is you will get caught out and your credibility is shot to pieces when you do that. And be aware that salespeople aren't amongst. Have you ever noticed this phenomena where there's this like famous quote and like most of them are attributed to Einstein or something like that, but Einstein probably never said them, right? So people are looking for authority to match to important information. And Einstein is like an authority. Well, salespeople are not trustworthy authorities like Einstein. So we cannot claim some mythical kind of thing. Like we have to tell true stories. And the way that you signal true stories, Mario, is how you start them. If I say in 1996, when I transferred to Norway to start my first sales job, that signals true story. It actually happened because I gave you a time and a place. I set it properly. And that's one of the things that a lot of people get wrong with storytelling. They don't start the story the right way. So that's how we signal a true story. But I'm strongly advising salespeople to do the work to find good, compelling, true stories. Every company has them. It's just a bit of research is required. And then you find out what really happened and go, wow, that's a really good story. I'm going to tell that. Practice telling a bit. You still want your delivery to be good, but don't make stuff up.
And that reminds me, this is what you just said is kind of basic 101. However, let me give my listeners.
You would think, right?
Let me give my listeners true examples of in a leadership role, not at Vingresso, but in past life, where I actually saw this happen with our sales team. And it went something like this. They were talking to customer in X industry. Let's just call it the automotive industry, right? This is just for example. They were talking to a potential customer in the automotive industry, and the customer said, do you have any experience inside here? And so they were telling me that, what happened, and the sales reps goes, oh, absolutely. Almost all of the big five are one of our customers in some way, shape, or form. Now, that was not true. One of the five was a customer, right? That was not true. So when the customer then pushes, my question to the sales rep was, what happened if the customer said, well, who?
Yeah.
And then the sales rep said, well, I would have told him, unfortunately, I can't release those details because, it's confidential. He's like, the customer would have never known the difference. And so my point to the sales rep was, no, but you're missing the point. Even if they said who and you couldn't release the name because of NDA, fair, your response might be right. You're quick on your feet. All right, no problem, snippety snappy. But the point I'm making is how far, if they find that out and that's not true, what else might you say that might not be true? No. And then when they find it out, man, you're shooting yourself in the foot right there, right? So we got to be careful. I think that's a real life example of how we can embellish those stories to people and boom, we have a problem, right?
Yeah, and there's something else to say there, Mario, which is salespeople think that they need a whole bunch of like success, I've got to be able to claim 100 clients here, 20 clients here. Whereas one really compelling story that the buyer can relate to is worth 100 of those other things. So you find the right story and tell it. I'd like to tell you about another company like yours, and then tell about that person. Put that client as the center of that story. You'll have your buyer really listening and really interested in that story, and they'll learn from it. They'll learn from that experience. So one good story is worth 10 or 100 facts about reference clients. So you just need to find the good one. It has to be true.
We got some facts. We should tell stories. We should use other people's stories if we don't have our own. We understand that, using personal stories helps build rapport. Okay. Business stories. How do we begin to construct? Give us some insight, some wisdom. I'm a salesperson. How do I construct the story? What's the start? Are there fight stories versus flee stories versus help stories versus what type of stories are there?
There's two main types of business stories that change the client's mind. The first type is called an insight story. It's when I tell you the story of how we discovered something about the buyer's market or their business that they don't understand. So that's the definition of insight. Insight means something that's not generally understood or appreciated. Otherwise, it's not insight. Otherwise, it's just common knowledge, right? So this is like the first thing about insight. And the problem with insight is, there's all this challenging and, I should challenge my client. If I challenge my client with something that's not generally appreciated, it's highly likely they push back. I'll give you a quick example of an insight story. This is from the medical industry. So there was a researcher in Australia in 1980s called Barry Marshall, and he was working on a project with a colleague, Robin Warren. They had a hypothesis that stomach ulcers were not caused by stress, but were caused by a particular bacteria in the gut. And they had problems to prove their hypothesis. They couldn't really work easily on animals, and no one was believing their idea. The conventional wisdom was that stomach ulcers were caused, by stress, and you just take a couple of weeks off and that cures them. And in frustration, Barry Marshall decided to create a potion from an infected patient, give himself an endoscopy, drink the potion, prove that he had stomach ulcers, and then take the antibacterial and cure himself. Well, when they wrote the paper about that, of course, it went all around the world, and it's a bit of a stunt. And Marshall and Warren won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in the year 2004 on the strength of that work around stomach ulcers. It's an insight story because it shows you the problem of insight. No one believes your story. You have to teach people how they can understand that it really works. You have to teach them how you learnt that. I also call it like the researcher story. How did your company discover that thing? Teach your client in the narrative, in the story, how they got the insight. So that's story type number one for, and entrepreneurial companies that are trying to break into a new market. Very often they don't have success stories. That's like the definition of an entrepreneurial company is we don't have any success yet, right? But they have insight and they need to tell insight stories. Most companies have had success and they need to tell the stories of their successful clients. Most people get this around the wrong way. And most marketing departments also get this around the wrong way. They think in terms of case study. So the case study is like 3 events. And the events are, here is my client in this terrible situation. Here's us riding in on our white horse and fixing it. And here's how wonderful things are now. And the problem with that structure is your buyer cannot identify with that because you made your company the hero of that story.
Yeah.
So you need to start with the buyer. So I give you a little example from my business. So when I do you know David Massover?
David who?
Massover. So he's a guy that's worked out of the US, written a couple of books on sales process, successful startup companies of his own, and then he got into coaching sales teams, a little bit what I do. And then he moved to Hungary, to Budapest, and couldn't speak the language. His wife is from there. And like, what kind of business do? I can't easily teach sales teams now that I'm in a foreign country and I can't speak the language. So he decided to use LinkedIn to start coaching salespeople wherever they happen to be in the world. That was going to be his new business. And I'd noticed some of his content on LinkedIn and liked it, told him I was writing a book, and he said, I'd love to read it. And I sent him the manuscript. And about a week later, he sent me a note saying, Mike, this is absolutely fantastic. I've started incorporating my personal story and an insight story into my conversation with salespeople. And just like you said, they're starting to tell me stories back. And he said, man, I'm the sales process guy. I've written books on sales processing, but I'd never thought how to use stories into that.
Right.
And I said, well, let's have a video conference and I'll listen to your story and maybe a little bit of coaching. And I did. I coached him a little bit on that story. And he very quickly filled his book. So he had, when you're a consultant, you're on 100% commission, right? You don't make any money if you don't sell business.
Exactly.
So he would very quickly filled his book and increased his rate, and he's doing fantastically well. But that structure, you notice, it starts with him. It tells you about his situation, his problem, not me. He meets me as a guide, which was the book actually, and then we get a plan, we avoid failure, we work on his story, he achieves success. So it's really important that the story starts with the client and you make them the center of the success story. And then it works well because your buyer will now just experience the story of the other client like them, and they'll buy into it. It's like trying before you buy. You get the experience of having your company as the supplier to them before they have to buy. That's how success stories work if you tell the story well from the perspective of the other client.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So that was, you said, the insight story, also known as the researcher story?
Researcher story or the success story.
Okay.
Yeah, the success story.
One and the same, or are those 3 different types of stories?
Those are 2 different types of stories. So story number 4, so the first 3 stories and 7 stories are your personal story, your key staff story. Can you tell the story of your CEO or your head of implementation or your technical sales guy? Your company story. Can you tell the story of your company? So those are the first 3 stories that connect. And then the stories that change people's mind and put new ideas in your client are your insight story. That's the story about how you discovered something about the client's market that they don't appreciate, but they should. And success stories, how someone else succeeded with your products and services and what it meant for them, how it changed them. And the last two stories are stories for closing the deal. Value stories. After we sign this deal, Mr. Vendor, what will you be like as a supplier? How do you behave? Are you an ethical company? Do you stand by your products and services? What's your behavior like? If you can tell stories that show how you behave, what it's like, it really helps lower the bar to help decision making. And you know, most deals, even above a few tens of thousands of dollars, are decided by a little stakeholder group in the client organization. You're not there. A lot of people are in that meeting that you might not even have met.
Yeah.
So how does your sponsor persuade those people? Well, value stories can be really big part of that. I'll give you an example from my time with Siemens, a big German multinational corporation, full of fantastic value stories.
Also one of our customers.
One of your clients, excellent. Yeah. I was in the CEO's office one day and we were chatting about a deal I was working on. I needed his help. And so this is the CEO of Australia, New Zealand. Still, and even that's a multi-billion-dollar organization, just Australia, New Zealand. And he took a call, which, you know, like you can tell, like I'm just sitting there. He took a call that was obviously serious. And he put the phone down and he said, Mike, we're at the delivery phase of a project for an electricity cable that's going from Tasmania, where I come from, actually in a little island south of Australia, to Australia. And the ship that's bringing the transformers from Germany to Australia hit a storm in the Southern Ocean, broke its rudder, and all 6 of these transformers are smashed beyond repair. And they take 18 months to build. You know, so that was actually from the Premier's department, from the Victorian government, like, how are you guys going to fix this problem, right?
Yeah.
And he said, you know, the Siemens board met in an emergency meeting. They didn't discuss litigation or who's going to pay for these things. They just like, how do we now make 6 transformers in 3 months instead of 18 months? And they delivered them on time. And the project actually delivered on time. They didn't slip the timeline because of that accident, right?
Wow.
That's a value story. How does your company behave when things go wrong? And these stories are unbelievably powerful. At some point in that stakeholder meeting, someone's going to say, look, you know, what happened? Can we trust these guys? And if your sponsor has heard that story, they may not tell that story, but their tone of voice will be, are you kidding? Come on, it's Siemens. Of course they're going to deliver. And that's how those stories work. They work very powerfully to give the perception to your client, yeah, we can trust these guys. It's worth paying more to have them. They've got our back. They'll be the right company to work with.
I like that. So we got personal stories, company stories. Yep. You said the story of your CEO. Does it have to be the CEO, or can it be the story of an executive leader?
When you meet a buyer for the first time, you know that for them to buy from your organization, they're going to have to trust. They're going to have to trust other people that you're probably going to bring into this buying process. Maybe your technical sales guy. If you can tell the story of that person ahead of time, you've actually primed the buyer to know and trust them ahead of time. It's a really powerful story type. Most salespeople don't know the story of the key people in their organization, so they can't tell it. So what I do is I just help the sales team know each other's story, because I can't brag about myself, but I can brag about you. Mario is brilliant. You know, he's 30 years in the business. He's done this and that, you know. So I can position you much better than I can position myself.
A similar concept to edifying your leadership, right? Taking the time to edify them, because if you talk them up to whether or not their skill, their vision, their whatever it might be, then 2 things happen, I think. 1, you have belief in the company and the mission, but you have belief in the people running the company and the mission, right?
The buyer is not buying the salesperson.
Yeah, they're buying the company.
They're buying the company. And more specifically, they're really buying the people that are going to come in and do the job for you.
Exactly.
It's those implementation people that they need. They need to trust that those people are competent, they're authorities, and they understand me. And if you can set those people up with a story by telling the story of these people that are coming in after you, the whole thing goes so much better. And the other thing is, a lot of salespeople get stuck in implementation. So they stop doing their selling job and they get stuck in the implementation. And that's because they haven't done the handover. They haven't told the story of the great people that are going to come in and do the job. So they end up being the dog's body trying to hold things together instead of going out and selling the next deal. So they're actually failing in their job. So they haven't set up their own organization for success with the buyer.
It's funny, you just mentioned something because we're involved in a fairly large, complex deal. And less than 30 minutes ago, I sent an email to the sales team and I said, for this size of a deal, why is it that I have not gotten on the phone yet with the buyers to talk to them about the delivery journey, right? And really correlate the story. Maybe you think about Vingresso's story. What we designed was we brought together all of the core influencers under one umbrella, but what we began implementing as our go-forward strategy is exactly what I did when I sat in the seat as a VP of sales and deployed this out to domestic and US sellers internationally, 350 people, right? That drove 100% rep adoption and 100% of our sellers in the domestic US where it was able to attribute one sales opportunity. What did that do? That actually landed me an opportunity where LinkedIn asked me personally as a VP of sales to come and speak at their annual users conference to talk about how we drove 100% rep adoption. So as I'm thinking about this opportunity, I sent it back to the sales team and I said, why have we not gotten me on the phone with these guys? Because the story that they're going to buy ultimately, and think about this, and this is something we really pride ourselves on. This particular customer asked to speak for references. And I'm like, what? We have over 500 LinkedIn recommendations. Over 500. We have oodles of videos and oodles of videos of people talking about our training program. Why would a customer, and by the way, this is never in our company history have we ever given anybody to speak to as a reference. Never, right? Why would the customer be asking for a reference? It's because they're not sold yet and they don't understand. They don't have belief in the process that's going to get them to where they need to go. The story has not been completed yet. And again, going back to, I didn't even think about this, but as you're speaking, as I think about the sales team needs to bring the implementation team in because references are only for the purposes of, did it work? Did they add value? If they're asking that question, it's a clear sign that they're not quite there yet. They need a little bit more push to be able to understand whether or not we can get them to where they want to go. It's interesting to me as I start thinking about what it is you're talking about and how important it is to engage what you called here is the value story, right? How does your company behave when something goes wrong or as you're implementing something? That's the value story, and that's the piece that's missing. If we win this deal, I'll cut you a commission.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, look, this is it's really common. So you, Mario, you know how to sell. You can do it yourself. And you said, how come I haven't been brought in on that deal? Why haven't the sales guys brought me in? And the thing is, the sales guys don't know all the stories they need to know yet. They don't know probably how to sell you, Mario. Can they tell Mario's story to sell Mario into that situation? So the client is actually looking forward to having a conversation with Mario because, wow. So really what I'm teaching here is there's a set of stories that probably only the top 10, 15% salespeople know how to tell. And usually in that top 10% is the owner, the top business leader, the people who don't even have a titled salesperson. So the sales enablement problem is, how do I get all those good stories out to the entire team? So first, know what sort of stories you need to find, collect them up. And I just use videos for this. So, if I say, Mario, tell me your story, I'm going to hold my iPhone up and just take a little video. That goes in the story library. It's an internal library. It doesn't have to be perfect sound or video, whatever. I just want to get a collection of, Jeff, tell me about how we won that deal with that client. What was their situation? Video it, put it in the library. And salespeople love those stories. They absolutely love listening to, particularly new members of your team. Like you said, they need the OPS. That's what they've got to find.
And for those of you that forgot what OPS stands for, other people's stories.
If you're brand new to the company, your own stories don't help much, right? You've got to have other people's stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and to, this whole discussion, learning the art of storytelling, it really can help you in several different areas. And this, I'm going to surmise this. You can, to be able to help establish rapport and trust, right? Help with presenting challenging maybe insights that get the customer to open up to you, help you differentiate your solution. You talked about sharing company values or visionary values as the way I think of it.
There's one more story we didn't talk about. It's the sales manager's teaching story. So you know that situation where your sponsor is trying to get the deal closed in the closed door meeting, in that decision meeting of stakeholders, and you're not there. Is there a way to coach them? Because the thing about it is your sponsor probably has never bought your products and services. They don't really understand how to do that. So how do I coach that person? Well, one way to think about it is I want to be the sales manager for that client. I want to teach them how to sell. And to do that, I need stories. And it depends on what the context is. It might be that they have one person on that stakeholder meeting who's just being difficult, or who thinks the money should be spent somewhere else. Or they might have the CEO doesn't understand the cost of delay. So you might need to tell a story about the cost of delay, or tell a story about how do we overcome difficult people in a meeting. So that's where I'm teaching the sponsor how to close the deal. And that's like the sales manager story. And that's a sophisticated story, but there are several examples in the book. And when you get that idea, you can really coach your buyer to get the deal done. And very few salespeople understand how to do that. And it's really important in big deals. When you've got big complex deals and lots of stakeholders, that's coaching that you do to get the deal done. Using stories is really powerful.
I love it. Well, you guys got it from Mr. Mike Adams, 7 stories every salesperson must tell, and how to use this to be able to help you sell more. That's phenomenal. Mike, do me a favor. If someone wants to connect with you, learn more, we'll have the link to your book inside of the show notes. But is it best on Twitter, LinkedIn? I mean, what's the best way to connect with you?
LinkedIn, please connect on LinkedIn. If your listeners who are highly intelligent, I'm sure, just type Mike Adams Storytelling, they'll get about 10 pages of all the ways to access my book and to find me. But an email message or LinkedIn message is the best way, I think, these days to get in touch. And I'd love to hear some stories from your listeners.
So if you are connecting with Mike on LinkedIn, please do not just send him a generic connection request message. Make sure you tell him that you heard him on Selling with Social talking about stories, right? Make sure you specify that. Mike, I always ask this question of all my guests, and that is, your all-time favorite movie, what is it?
We had this question on another storytelling, and I said the movie Jaws, and and it's funny, probably I wouldn't watch Jaws again now. I know the movie, I've seen it so many times, but Jaws is a fantastic movie for storytellers because it's stories inside stories inside stories, and a lot of people, when they think storytelling, they think this big Hollywood production. And you and I have really just been talking about little anecdotes. But do you remember at the beginning of Jaws, there's the story of the USS Indianapolis, which is an awful story from the Second World War, of where the ship that was sunk, a warship that was sunk, and most of the sailors were eaten by sharks over a period of days. Oh, and wow. That little anecdote at the beginning of Jaws just sets the scene of horror, of what it must be like to be eaten by a shark. And I just love it as a storytelling instruction movie, to just notice stories inside stories inside stories. And that's a fantastic movie, actually.
I love it. Jaws it is then. Well, listen, it's been great having you on the show. For all of you listening into Selling with Social, make sure you connect with Mike Adams, the author of 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. The link will be inside of the show notes. And thanks so much, Mike. Hey, thanks for listening to the Selling with Social Sales Podcast. Did you enjoy that show? If so, would you do me a huge favor and give the Selling with Social podcast a rating and review on iTunes? That would be super awesome. Also, if you want to easily find our show, just go to vengreso.com. That's VENGRESO.com and click on podcast. From there, you'll find the Selling with Social podcast. Thanks for listening in. And until the next show, be awesome. Mario Martinez Jr.